If anything happened to her, she said the kids did it.
Friends and family of Nikki Whitehead say they believe she was killed by her own twin 16-year-old daughters. Now charged as adults in their mom's death, the teens deny any involvement in their mom's murder. Whitehead was found stabbed to death in her home in January.
I've lost my oldest child. I lost my first set of grandkids.
Their grandmother, Linda Whitehead, says just a few years ago, the twins Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah were in ballet and getting academic honors.
So I always saw them at Harvard or Yale, and never would I have ever imagined that they would be sitting in a jail cell for killing their mother.
But their grandmother says the girls started to get into trouble when they were 14, even attacking and injuring their mom in a fight over cell phone privileges. The girls were also temporarily placed with their great-grandmother, but a juvenile court decided to send them back to their mother's house.
They were placed back into the home, and 6 days later, my daughter's found dead.
Police say Nikki Whitehead was found beaten and stabbed. Police found blood throughout her home.
Mom's yelling?
We all yelling.
Everybody's yelling.
We mad.
I had took the pot from her. This way she had grabbed the knife and kind of turned like he said, get back. But she didn't keep the knife in her hand.
My mom is winning that battle with the knife or whatever, so I picked up the pot and I hit her with the pot. She bit me in my chest. Like I said, I'm not that big, so when she bit me, she latched on to me, and I'm trying to get her off of me because it hurts. I'm trying to punch her, I guess. And I think Dad stabbed her. He stabbed her.
What did y'all do?
They put her in the tub.
What's she saying?
She hated her.
Imagine the unimaginable. The very people you've nurtured, loved and sacrificed for, the ones you thought would be your future, turning on you. Now what if it wasn't just one child, but two? Two sisters, once full of love, who grew up in your care, now bound by something darker, something so unthinkable. No one could have predicted it. This isn't a bad dream. It's a chilling reality. But this isn't a story about rebellious teens or a simple family dispute. This is a tale that shattered everything we know about family bonds. Two sisters, Jazz and Taz, in an act of violence so brutal, they forever changed the course of their lives and the lives of everyone around them. But what would drive them to commit such an unspeakable crime? Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank you, my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments don't just support this channel. They help keep these stories alive. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing community, one that believes every story deserves to be told and no victim should ever be forgotten. Now, let's get into it. Nikki Whitehead's story began long before the shocking events of January 2010. Born on April 18, 1975, Nikki's life was marked by hardship from the very start. She came into the world while her mother, Linda, was serving time in prison for drug-related crimes. Without her mother to care for her, Nikki was raised by her grandmother, Della, in Decatur, Georgia. Della, already facing her own struggles, took Nikki in and did what she could to provide stability. But it wasn't easy. Nikki never had the chance to experience the normal childhood that so many kids take for granted. Growing up in a chaotic environment, Nikki was exposed to a world that was anything but peaceful. She watched as her mother, Linda, battled her own demons. And Nikki's life began to reflect that same instability. She became accustomed to a life of uncertainty, and by the time she reached her teenage years, the foundation she had been given was already starting to crack. Like many teenagers, Nikki began to rebel. She fell in with the wrong crowd, experimenting with substances and making decisions that would later haunt her. It wasn't long before Nikki's behavior spiraled out of control. She was just 17 when she found out she was pregnant. But the news wasn't just about one child, it was about two. On November 27, 1993, Nikki gave birth to twins, Jasmiyah, Jazz, and Tasmiyah, Taz. This should have been a turning point in her life, but Nikki's situation was far from ideal. At the time, she was still struggling with her own demons, and the responsibility of raising 2 children would prove to be more than she could handle alone. The father of the twins was hardly a source of support. His relationship with Nikki was unstable, and eventually, he moved to Canada, leaving her to raise their daughters by herself. For Nikki, this was just another chapter of abandonment and loneliness. Despite being a mother, she was still dealing with the baggage of her own troubled past. The weight of raising 2 children alone began to take a toll. While she did the best she could, the foundation of her family was shaky from the start, and it set the stage for the challenges that would come later. So, as Nikki tried to navigate her own life, there was one constant figure who held everything together for her daughters: Della, Nikki's grandmother, and the twins' rock. Della played an irreplaceable role in raising Jazz and Taz, providing the stability Nikki was unable to offer. With Nikki often caught up in her own struggles, Della became more than just a caregiver. She was the foundation on which Jazz and Taz relied. Della was the one who made sure the twins had a consistent routine. She kept them grounded in a way that Nikki, with her chaotic life, simply couldn't. Della offered them the stability Nikki couldn't provide, though it wasn't always easy. On the other hand, Nikki's presence in her daughters' lives was inconsistent. She loved them deeply, but her struggles often overshadowed her ability to be the mother they needed. Nikki was frequently distracted by her own demons, her past struggles with substances, her tumultuous relationships, and the never-ending battle to find her place in the world. As a result, her role in the girls' lives often felt more like that of an older sister than a mother. Despite the challenges, Nikki tried to provide for her daughters. She worked as a hairstylist, a steady job that brought in some income, and in her mind, a chance to rebuild. It was a step towards something better, a fresh start, a way to give her daughters the future she never had. But even with that job, Nikki was still trying to find balance. She wanted more, for herself and for Jazz and Taz. She wanted to be the mother they needed. She wanted to provide them with opportunities, but no matter how hard she tried, the cracks remained. The struggle to juggle work, personal issues, and motherhood meant her role in their lives was often secondary. By the time she started to regain some stability, the damage was already done. Then, Nikki met Robert, a 55-year-old truck driver. He wasn't just any man. Robert was the kind of person Nikki had been longing for, someone who offered the stability and security she had never truly known. Their relationship moved fast. They met, connected. And before long, Nikki found herself hoping that Robert would be the one to change everything. Robert had a home in Conyers, Georgia, a quiet, safer neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. A fresh start, a chance to leave behind the turmoil of the past, a place where things could finally be different. But change isn't always welcomed. For Jazz and Taz, it wasn't a new beginning, it was an upheaval. They had spent their lives under Della's care. She was their constant, their safe haven. Moving to Robert's home meant leaving behind everything: Della, their school, their friends, their freedom. And now, after years of being absent, Nikki was stepping in as the primary authority figure, in a home they never wanted to be in. The tension was immediate. Jazz and Taz resented the move, and the rules that came with it. They had grown accustomed to a certain level of freedom while living with Della, who, although loving, was more lenient, giving them space to make their own decisions. Now, under Nikki's roof, things were different. Nikki, eager to create stability, imposed rules and structure, things the twins saw as unfair and controlling. They didn't want this new life. They didn't want this new version of their mother. A woman who suddenly seemed like a stranger, trying to control them in ways that felt foreign and suffocating. For Nikki, moving into Robert's home was meant to be a fresh start, a chance to finally provide her daughters with the life she had always dreamed of. But for Jazz and Taz, it felt like a loss. They weren't just moving into a new house. They were being forced into a new way of life, one that challenged everything they had known, one that made them feel like they were losing control. As Nikki fought to make this new dynamic work, the resentment between her and her daughters began to simmer. They resisted her efforts, and no matter how hard she tried, the bond between them only fractured further. The tension that would later spiral out of control had already begun to take root. Time passed in Robert's house, and Jazz and Taz began to push back. What started as typical teenage defiance quickly escalated into something more. They skipped school. They hung out with older boys. They experimented with marijuana. The very behaviors Nikki had hoped to avoid were now becoming their reality. Nikki found herself in a constant battle. Every attempt to regain control only made things worse. She enforced curfews. She took away privileges. She tried to restrict who they could see. But the more she imposed rules, the more the twins rebelled. It wasn't just teenage defiance anymore. It was an all-out challenge to her authority. The tension mounted. Nikki, emotionally drained and unsure of what to do, felt her grip slipping. She had tried. She had given everything, but nothing seemed to reach them. The connection she had once envisioned, a balance of love and discipline, was vanishing before her eyes. Desperate, confused, Nikki knew she couldn't handle this alone. She needed help, family counseling, therapy, anything to bridge the ever-widening gap between her and her daughters. But as she sat in the thick of it all, she wondered if it was already too late. The more she fought to pull them back, the further they seemed to fall away. Things had been escalating between Nikki and her daughters for months, but the first real signs of trouble came one evening, when Jazz snuck out to meet her boyfriend. It wasn't the first time the twins had tested the boundaries Nikki had set, but this time it felt different. Jazz had slipped out without telling her mother, and Nikki, already on edge, panicked when she realized what had happened. Frantic and desperate, Nikki called 911. "My daughter's gone. I can't find her." Her voice trembled with fear. She didn't know where Jazz had gone or what was happening, but the thought of her 13-year-old daughter being out alone at night filled Nikki with dread. When the officer arrived at the house, she found Nikki in a state of distress, clearly shaken. But when she spoke with Jazz and Taz, their calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to their mother's panic. Both twins appeared sweet and innocent, acting as if nothing was wrong. They didn't seem upset. They didn't even seem concerned about the fact that their mother was terrified. And yet, Nikki's fear was impossible to ignore. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was no concrete evidence of anything, but there was a quiet tension in the air. The twins' nonchalant attitude, combined with Nikki's visible fear, created a growing sense of unease. At the time, nothing could be proven. The officer had no reason to take immediate action. The girls hadn't done anything to warrant further investigation, but still, there was a feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface, something unspoken. For now, Nikki's fears remained unaddressed, but in hindsight, this moment would be seen as an early warning. Officer Scruggs's instinct had been right. This wasn't just about sneaking out. It was the underlying tension, the fear in Nikki's eyes, the growing sense that something darker was taking root within the family. And soon, that darkness would come to the surface. The morning of January 12, 2010, started like so many others in the Whitehead household, tense and filled with conflict. Jazz and Taz had stayed out late the night before, ignoring Nikki's rules. And now, Nikki was determined to put her foot down. "You're going to school today, no excuses." Her voice was firm. She was exhausted. Her patience had worn thin. The twins weren't thrilled by the idea, but this time, Nikki wasn't backing down. The twins, however, had no intention of complying. They stormed out of their room, ready for confrontation. Their teenage rebellion had escalated over the last few months, and now it was spilling over into something much darker. Nikki stood firm. But as the argument continued, she could feel the anger rising within her daughters. This wasn't just defiance. They were challenging her authority in a way that felt more dangerous than ever before. The tension intensified. Words were exchanged, sharp and biting, and the situation quickly spun out of control. Nikki, feeling cornered, helpless, grabbed the nearest object she could find, a kitchen pot. It wasn't a weapon she had planned to use, but in that moment, it was the only thing within reach. She was trying to protect herself, trying to gain control over the chaos unfolding in front of her. But the twins weren't backing down. In a split second, the fight turned physical. They wrestled the pot from Nikki's hands, and suddenly, she was losing the upper hand. The anger in Jazz and Taz's eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't just teenage rebellion anymore. They were done listening. And then, one of the twins reached for a kitchen knife. Everything shifted. The knife, now in their hands, turned the chaos into something far more dangerous. Nikki, struggling to regain control, tried to back away. But it was too late. The twins were in a frenzy, and they overpowered her. What had started as a verbal argument had turned into something far more violent. Nikki was no longer just trying to discipline her daughters. She was fighting for her life. She did everything she could to defend herself, but she couldn't stop the inevitable. The knife found its mark. The fight grew even more brutal as the twins continued their attack. Nikki's strength was waning. The battle that had started as a mother-daughter argument had become a deadly struggle. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was a violent, uncontrollable outburst, fueled by months, maybe years, of frustration, anger, and emotional wounds. The attack on Nikki Whitehead had already spiraled far beyond her control, but in a final act of desperation, she broke free, bloodied, in pain. She bolted from the house, stumbling toward the nearest neighbor's home. It was just before 7:30 a.m. She rang the doorbell frantically, her heart racing, hoping, praying someone would answer. Inside, the neighbor, still half asleep, stirred at the sudden noise. Confused, he made his way to the door. But when he opened it, Nikki was gone. It wasn't long before Jazz and Taz caught up with their mother. They dragged her back into the house, and this time there was no escape. In the chaos of the attack, Nikki was thrown into the bathtub, weak, bloodied. And unable to defend herself, she was still conscious as the cold water began to fill the tub. It was in these final moments that Nikki spoke words that would haunt the twins forever. "I hate you. You're going to jail," she said, her voice trembling with fear and defiance. After Nikki's death, Jazz and Taz didn't act like grieving daughters. Instead, they attempted to go on with their day as if nothing had happened. They went straight to the nearest gas station, hoping to get a ride to school. They knew the alibi was crucial. Being seen on camera at school was their plan to distance themselves from the crime scene. By the time they arrived at school, it was hours late, but they didn't seem to care. They went straight to the counselor's office to pick up late passes and carried on like it was just another normal day. The school didn't raise any concerns. They were just two girls who happened to be late. But the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Hours later, when they returned home, reality began to settle in. The twins had expected to return to a house swarming with police, but when they arrived, the house was eerily quiet. No sirens, no flashing lights. It was as if nothing had happened at all. That's when it hit them, the full weight of what they had done. Instead of the authorities coming to them, they would have to call the police themselves. So, despite their initial attempts to cover their tracks, Jazz and Taz dialed 911. They had no idea that, at that moment, the investigation into their mother's death would soon begin to turn in their direction. On the 911 call, Jazz was heard telling the dispatcher in a calm tone, "We found our mom. She's dead. She's in the bathtub." This was a critical turning point in the case. Although they claimed to have discovered Nikki's body, their calm demeanor, their lack of visible distress, was chilling. When police arrived at the scene, their suspicions immediately began to grow. Inside the house, officers found Nikki's body in the bathtub, and the sheer brutality of the crime was undeniable. The crime scene was chaotic. There was no sign of forced entry, indicating that the killer was someone who had either lived there or been allowed into the home. But what really struck the officers was the overwhelming smell of bleach. Someone had tried and failed to clean up the crime scene. Blood was still visible on the floor. The house seemed hastily tidied, as if the twins were trying to remove the evidence. Their behavior didn't match the gravity of the situation. They were eerily calm, almost as if they had rehearsed their story. They clung to the same narrative, claiming they had found their mother already dead and had no idea who had done it. They even cried in front of the officers, but it was clear to those investigating something didn't feel right. As detectives pieced together the events, they noticed a strange detail. Jazz and Taz were wearing jackets and gloves when they were questioned at the police station, despite the warm weather outside. Another red flag. And then there was Taz's hand, a deep cut on her finger. She claimed it was from a fight between the two of them. But the officers were beginning to feel more certain. The twins knew far more than they were letting on. As the investigation continued, the cover-up became clear. They had removed the evidence: Nikki's purse, her phone, a kitchen pot, and the very knife used in the attack, stashing them in plastic bags. In the days following Nikki Whitehead's murder, Jazz and Taz's behavior was deeply unsettling. They seemed unaffected, carrying on as if nothing had happened. They attended prom, hung out with their boyfriends, the very boys their mother had forbidden them to see. They acted like normal teenagers, carefree, oblivious to the gravity of the crime they had just committed. No signs of grief, no remorse. It was as if their mother's death didn't faze them in the slightest. But as the investigation picked up speed, the mounting evidence couldn't be ignored. Police soon discovered crucial items that would become key in building their case. Blood-soaked clothing belonging to the twins was found in the washing machine, proof that they had tried to clean themselves up after the crime. a clump of Nikki's hair found inside one of the girl's boots, a chilling reminder of the violent struggle that had taken place. And perhaps the most damning of all, on Taz's arm. A bite mark. A mark that matched Nikki's teeth. Proof that in her final moments, the mother had fought back. Meanwhile, Nikki's family was growing more suspicious. At her funeral, her brother, devastated by the loss of his sister, confronted Jas and Taz. His frustration boiled over as he demanded answers. "What did you do to my sister?" His anger was justified. How could anyone who had just lost a loved one, especially a mother, behave so nonchalantly? The twins were escorted out of the funeral, their indifference raising even more suspicion. As detectives dug deeper, the pieces fell into place. Blood stains throughout the house, a brutal attack. The faint smell of bleach still lingering, an attempt to clean up, but a failed one. Whoever had committed this murder had tried to hide the evidence, but it was clear from the clues left behind. The twins were trying to cover their tracks. All signs now pointed toward Jas and Taz. The mounting physical evidence, blood stains, the hair in the boot, the bite mark, along with the strange, emotionless behavior of the twins, made it impossible to ignore their involvement. The police knew they were closing in on the truth, but there was still one more crucial piece of the puzzle that would reveal what happened that tragic morning. On May 21st, 2010, after months of mounting evidence, the police had seen enough. Jas and Taz were arrested. The twins were calm, almost eerily so, as they were taken into custody. But as they were driven to the police station, their casual remarks only served to raise more suspicion. While sitting in the back of the police car, Taz, almost absent-mindedly, commented, "The day you find a murder weapon with my fingerprints on it, please do that." Her words hung in the air. It was a chilling statement, as if she was already anticipating her involvement in the crime being discovered. Little did she know. The police had already gathered plenty of evidence that would make her comment seem less like an innocent remark, and more like an ominous prediction. When the twins arrived at the station, their behavior became even more unsettling. Despite the severity of the situation, they stuck to their story, insisting that they had no part in their mother's death. They claimed to have found the crime scene, presenting themselves as victims of a tragedy they had no involvement in. But their actions told a different story. Both girls acted erratically. Taz, in particular, showed signs of extreme nervousness, fidgeting and rocking back and forth in the interrogation room, a behavior that wasn't typical for someone who was truly innocent. The officers, already suspicious, noted how the twins tried to maintain their composure. But their every action betrayed them. Their words didn't match their actions, and their lack of emotion seemed increasingly unnatural. It was clear that the twins' story didn't align with the evidence, and their erratic behavior only added fuel to the growing fire of suspicion. Despite their claims of innocence, the truth was beginning to unfold, and the police were determined to piece together exactly what had happened in that house. On the morning of January 12th, the trial began, and the weight of the charges was undeniable. Jas and Taz, now facing the harsh reality of their actions, were officially charged with first-degree murder. Their once hopeful futures now hinged on the outcome of the legal proceedings. But the trial quickly took a turn, as Taz, realizing the gravity of the situation, agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she would tell the truth about what happened that fateful day. Shortly after, Jas followed suit, Her lawyer, explaining the bleak prospects ahead, convinced her to accept the plea deal as well. Both sisters, now facing the consequences of their decisions, confessed to the crime they had tried so hard to hide. Their confessions were chilling in their alignment with the evidence the police had gathered. Their accounts mirrored the details of the brutal attack on their mother, confirming what investigators had long suspected. But as the legal process continued, something became clear. While their actions were horrific, there was a deeper story at play. The investigation revealed how years of emotional neglect, instability, and growing resentment toward Nikki had shaped their behavior. They hadn't just acted out of sudden rage. The layers of trauma, abandonment, and fractured relationships had built up over time, eventually culminating in a tragic and irreversible decision. Their mother, despite her efforts, was unable to overcome the years of neglect, emotional turmoil, and fractured bond that had taken hold of her daughters. In the end, both sisters were sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of their mother. The judge handed down the sentence. But there was still a sliver of hope for a possible early release. Jazz and Taz's tentative parole date was set for 2025, when they would be 46 years old. If granted parole, they would walk free, after spending 3 decades behind bars. If not, they would remain incarcerated even longer, serving out the consequences of a decision that altered their lives, and the life of their family, forever. Their story is one of tragedy, trauma, and ultimately, the painful reality of what happens when emotional scars run too deep to heal. The tragic case of Jazz and Taz Whitehead raises important questions that go beyond the crime itself. It forces us to reflect on the lasting impact of trauma, especially on children. Studies show that 1 in 4 children in the U.S. will experience a traumatic event before the age of 4. And those early experiences can shape emotional development and behavior for a lifetime. For Jazz and Taz, their childhood was filled with instability, neglect, and uncertainty, setting the stage for what would eventually unfold. Nikki, despite her imperfections, tried her best to rebuild a life for herself and her daughters. She wanted to be a stable and loving mother, but the emotional scars from their past were far too deep to simply erase. Her attempts to reconnect with them, to provide the care and structure they desperately needed, were overshadowed by years of trauma. The girls, having grown up under the care of their grandmother, Della, and without a consistent parental presence, developed their own coping mechanisms that often led to rebellion, and ultimately, violence. As we reflect on this story, it's hard not to wonder, what could have been done differently? Could the years of instability have been avoided? Was there a way to heal the emotional wounds that had festered for so long? The answers are complex, and while we may never fully understand the depth of the twins' pain, one thing is clear. The impact of their troubled upbringing played a significant role in their tragic actions. Ultimately, this case raises an uncomfortable question. How far can trauma push a person? And what happens when love, the very thing that is supposed to protect and nurture, turns into something darker, something unrecognizable? This story is a painful reminder that without the right support, love can morph into something unthinkable, and the consequences, they can be devastating for everyone involved. The true cost of trauma reaches far beyond just the individuals at the center of it. It affects entire families, entire lives, and in cases like this, there are no easy answers. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video,